Over the past several years, I've had the pleasure of working with pharmaceutical manufacturers of all sizes and all stages of product development in tackling some of these really essential questions regarding moving to a universe in which we have value-based pricing, and also, very importantly, ensuring that patients have meaningful access to these breakthrough therapies. It is a topic that is incredibly important to me, as I know it is to all of us here today. And my objective for our time today is for us to share some of the latest thinking about how we can actually achieve that ambitious aim and what it looks like in practice. And so I'm going to turn it over to Tamar and Erin to just briefly introduce themselves and help us understand what their vantage point is in thinking about these important challenges.
Great, thank you, Margot. Well, I'll first introduce myself, Tamar Thompson, proudly a member of the MassBio board, and our leader here, Bob in the front, does a fantastic job with this conference and all conferences every year, so very happy to be a part of this family and organization. But my day job is with Bristol Myers Squibb, and I run the Federal Executive Branch Strategy Team as well as State Government Affairs.
Great, thank you.
Yep, and my name's Erin Mystery, so I'm a Managing Director in Pricing and Market Access at Syneos Health. We work with manufacturers all the way from phase 1 through phase 4. And what we've seen recently is, to many of you in the room, there's been a lot of questions that have been asked around pricing and the reimbursement dynamics earlier and earlier in the process, even at the investor stage. So we've worked with many of the manufacturers in this room and continue to do so.
Great. So I'm going to kick it off with a question about politics, and I'm going to
Oh,
let Tamar take the lead on this one. But the pharmaceutical industry has certainly come under considerable political and public scrutiny in recent times on account of the cost of drugs, and there has been also finger pointing among drug developers, payers, providers, and others with respect to who is responsible for the high cost of healthcare. Where do you see us being able to find common ground?
Well, in this particular political environment, I don't think that's going to happen at the federal level at all. It actually occurs more so at the state level. And I always say that all things, whether good policy or bad, incubates at the state level, and then it becomes federal policy. And this state knows that better than anyone because the ACA, which has been so controversial and so full of debate, actually was born from a blueprint here in Massachusetts. And so when you look at things like the state exchanges, when you look at price transparency, even the gag clause that we now have at a federal level, all of those policies were passed at the state level first. And so I don't see us having, the political environment is in DC, toxic is probably not even the strongest or best word that I could use for that environment, and you know this very well, Margot. But it seems to be that, when we meet with state legislators, there's often a educational barrier because the folks at the state level also have day jobs, right? So they're not always dedicated to healthcare. They're in session at various different times. In Massachusetts, we have a longer session than most. In some states, it's 2 weeks. But if you can do a good job of educating folks at the state level, it may take longer, and even internally within my company, oftentimes things happen. My marketing and sales team is like, go talk to Congress and fix this, Tamar. And I was like, well, if I could, I would. But, the marketing and sales teams, we have to bring them along to understand the politics because they get so frustrated because none of this is very sensical at all. And I totally get that. But I do think that, in states where we have a home state or a footprint is where, at least for me and my company, we've had the most impact because it's not just about drug pricing, it's about jobs, it's about the economy, it's about the infrastructure that we bring to those states and the value of good, high-paying jobs that are brought into those states for people with, skills that are not just technical. We're talking about people who are janitorial staff who maintain our facilities to those who are in R&D and discovery. And so I think the common ground to be had, long-winded answer, but is at the state level and that people should pay more attention and focus there.
That's Great, and I want to ask a couple follow-up questions, but first, Mike is with us now, so
Thank you, and my apologies, folks. My calendar was wrong, and I thought it was early, not late, so my apologies.
we're delighted to have you here. Do you want to briefly introduce yourself and tell us about your perspective or where you're situated with respect to thinking about value-based pricing issues?
Sure. So just by way of introduction, Mike Bonney, I've been in the industry for about 40 years now. I know it's hard to imagine given how youthful I am. I currently don't have an operating job, so I'm basically a ward of the state. I do chair 3 biotech company boards, Alnylam, Magenta, and Kaleido, here in the greater Boston area, and then I serve on 3 other boards, Celgene, Syros, and Sarepta. So I have a pretty broad platform at which to look at different kinds of therapeutic modalities and what the range of pricing considerations that set of companies deals with. I grew up as a commercial guy, so I am one of the few folks around, I think, on these boards who actually carried a bag and sold drugs as my first job way back when in the 80s when we rode horses from doctor to doctor. And I would say at one level, we have always in the biopharmaceutical industry priced for value. What's different in the recent past is we're now to a much greater degree than I've ever seen previously, willing to put the performance of our drugs at risk or put the payment for the performance of our drugs at risk with the patients and with the payers in order to ensure that they get as broad access as possible, as quickly as possible, and in fact, as a response to the growing public concern about the cost of medicines. And there's sort of 2 pieces of that in my view. One is the list price, which anyone inside the industry knows is it's the basis for lots of reimbursement, but it's really a fictitious number. And the out-of-pocket for the patient, which is not a fictitious number. And it's a place where I think our industry and the payers have a fundamentally different set of incentives. The payers want our patients to have out-of-pocket skin in the game, if you will. And the theory from an economic standpoint makes a lot of sense, which is if you have an informed consumer and ready access to information, and they have discretion on what they're going to spend, the market will define where the quality-price intersection is. Unfortunately, I don't think anyone would argue that healthcare, particularly in the United States, but really anywhere in the developed world, is a clear, well-functioning market. And so while they've accomplished the objective the payers have of getting the patients to put more money into the game and hopefully make better decisions for them, that's not really what's happened. What's happened is it's created an obstacle to getting access to a drug that could make a real difference for a patient's life. And we've got to figure out as an ecosystem, not just as a biopharmaceutical industry, how to solve that equation. Value-based pricing, I think, is a step in that direction. I don't think it's the last step that we'll take, but it's an important step at this point in time, in my view.
And
I mean, one of the challenges, I think, with value-based pricing is that a lot of times the value of the product is realized after phase 3, right? So you're in a real-world evidence situation where you can actually prove the economic value of that product. And so as a manufacturer, does price come first, or does actual data come first, right? And so building, one of the things that we encourage manufacturers to consider is building really robust HEOR economic models into the phase 3 design so that you can start to gravitate towards that model, because I think that's part of the challenge is this real-world evidence component that really doesn't prove the economic value of the product until quite a long ways after launch sometimes. The other thing I would say, just back to the question around common ground, we do a lot of what I do in my day job is a lot of research, a lot of strategy, design, scenario planning for manufacturers. But when we think about the triangle, the general triangle, there's more than just those, but the main folks are your patients, your payers, and your KOLs. We have a really strong payer-KOL network, right? Generally speaking, the KOLs really influence the payers, and it's a good relationship there. And there's a really strong KOL and patient dynamic for the most part, right? But the other side of that triangle is the payer and the patient relationship. or the payer and the payer and the patient relationship. And I think that there's a lot of effort that's been put in by advocacy groups in that type of environment to bring that relationship closer together. But payers, it's hard for manufacturers, right? Because you're bringing information from a patient, you're talking to the patient community, you may be funding part of that. How do you go to a payer without a conflict of interest and bring real-life patient data and functionality that your product is bringing? Building that into that system is very difficult to do. And the reality of the situation is that payers are constrained from a resource perspective, right? So are they really going to engage in a phase 2, phase 1 clinical trial when they know the likelihood of that product getting to market is pretty low? How do you get them to engage earlier in that development process?
So I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I do think, and Scott Gottlieb was mentioned earlier on a couple of panels, that Scott's stance on developing guidance around FDAMA 114 has really helped with the risk factor and lowering that risk for manufacturers and payers to engage earlier on in those conversations. And I do think that there is a role for advocacy groups to play, and they are, many of them, the larger ones, are stepping up to have a role. FDA has done a really great job of engaging patients in the platform of clinical trial development, and I know that many companies are doing the same. I do believe that advocacy relationship is not quite there yet from a payer to patient standpoint. But I will just tie this back to, from a policy and politics standpoint, all of that, I think that triangulation works really great. It's very complex and complicated, and if you don't have an elevator pitch to sell to a congressman or a senator, or quite frankly, in my world, I do a lot of work with CMS. It falls under my purview. Oftentimes, we think going into an agency like CMS, I mean, this is the federal government. They pay for billions of dollars in claims every month, not year, every month. And so you would think that the agency that has that level of financial responsibility would also have some level of clinical understanding and sensibility about the healthcare system, and oftentimes they do not. And I think that, for me, continues to be a significant challenge that we have in the marketplace. There are sophisticated payers who are willing to participate in the process on the commercial side, and that lends to some sophistication in some cases on the Medicaid side as well. But I think at the federal level, we have a lot of challenges with how to take a very complex conversation and narrow it down to an audience that can understand it, because they are the policymakers and the decision makers for our country.
And Tamar, you raised a really important point, which is, the federal government is the big elephant in the room, despite the laboratories of innovation that are well underway within the states. Should we be so discouraged that there's no room to move forward towards a universe of value-based pricing at the federal level? Or do any of you see windows of opportunity where we could actually make, strategic gains with respect to FDA or particular federal agencies?
So in my personal opinion, and again, for those who are reporters in the room, I'm not speaking as BMS in this particular capacity, but I don't feel that the way that value-based purchasing is structured today is applicable at the federal level, and here's why. Nobody pays CMS, and CMS, pays out claims. So if you're looking at a value-based contract for a product that is what you would call a buy and bill, or Part B as in boy under the medical benefit, you're paying through the supply chain. If you look at that system, it's the wholesaler, the distributor, and the provider that is getting that funding. CMS isn't. They're the payor. So in a value-based system, how do you reconcile that on the back end and give the government the savings in today's environment? I think it's a very different paradigm on the state side, and I think it's a very different paradigm on the commercial side of things. But the reality is that CMS governs, right, at the federal level, and they have payors, or MACs, Medicare Administrative Contractors, who, guess what, are the commercial payers managing on their behalf to pay out those claims. But I do think that we have to make some changes to the fundamental structure of the supply chain from the funding flow standpoint before we could see value for the government. Now, if we take that down to a lower level, So if you're asking me, should we be engaging in value-based contracts with CMS as a payor, I think there's some challenges with that today from a governmental standpoint. But if you're asking if value-based contracts underneath that umbrella could exist in various different ways, which could then contribute to savings for the federal government, then absolutely yes. But I think it's the complexity, so it's not a yes or no answer. It's the complexity of understanding the funding flow of the system and then creating value-based arrangements that work for the environment. And then I have to say this, because I know we all know this, but I just have to say it. Value-based contracts don't work for every single product in the system, right? So if you're talking about a curative therapy, it seems like it's a cleaner pathway to get to a value-based arrangement. And I know we've all seen, things around Hep C. The state of Louisiana is doing an amortized model or a mortgage-type model with Hep C payments. For me, the big question that I have in a model like that is, how do you carry that mortgage with you, right? So let's just say I'm a Medicaid patient, I'm churning from fee-for-service to MCO. Who takes on that risk? Is it the state who takes on that risk, and how do we manage that going forward? Or what if I'm a commercial employee working for my current company, and we do some amortized model that way? Is it my risk to take on when I leave that company because of displacement or a better job opportunity? Or does my new company take on that risk because they're self-funded employers? And so, there are a lot of underlying complexities. I don't want to be the Debbie Downer in the room, because I think that there is a huge opportunity for us to change the paradigm of the system and the way it works today, but there are also a lot of complexities when you dig down into that question that we would have to address before it could be a successful model.
And one really important point that you raised there is the need to consider the meaning of value on a product-by-product basis. Mike, I know you've been able to look at this from the vantage point, of being a CEO for over 10 years. How do you grapple with value-based questions and thinking about value-based pricing when you have to look across an entire portfolio of products?
Yeah, I don't think we're at the point where we can basically describe a system that works for every product. I mean, that's the bottom line, is you sort of have to think of this. Where do you want to be strategically in terms of realizing the value that your products have demonstrated through the development in real-world context? And then how is it best to achieve that product by product? And then and the way you have to make that decision in this country is very much based on how is your product actually distributed and used, because of the inefficiencies or the competing incentives that exist across the distribution and payer chains, depending upon which set of insurers a given patient is dealing with. Certainly, I've had experiences where I was willing to take risk on price of a product, but the payers weren't. And it was really a function of, even though it was a very big product, the payer couldn't imagine the amount of work necessary to change their systems to track outcome in a way that would align with what we knew, both from the clinical and from the real-world experience of using this drug. And so even though we were, as the innovator, we were willing to say, this drug performs, you pay us. If it doesn't perform, you don't pay us. We couldn't get the system to change how they worked. We called it the paperclip problem. From the payer standpoint, we were like buying paper clips, even though it was $1 billion product. And so they wouldn't change their system to accommodate a better way to buy paper clips. But what I am seeing in the years since that is that now, even in one-off circumstances, significant payers are willing to start trying to figure out how to collect the data to be able to participate in a value-based scheme. And I think as we look at more and more one-time cure type therapies coming, it's in everybody's best interest to figure out different ways to pay for these drugs, because in our current system, you can't imagine an upfront payment for the value that is being delivered if you're curing a genetic disease or curing a cancer that will have 30 or 40 years of high-quality life for that person preserved, and they're going to have 16 different payers in the commercial realm, or 3 different administrators if they're Medicare patients or Medicaid patients. how are you going to allocate that value across that different set of payers? So you really have to think about it, I think, piece by piece. I'd also argue that, to a point that one of my colleagues made earlier, real world matters a lot, because we all know that the phase 3 program, the pivotal study, whether it's a phase 2 or a phase 3, is an artificial environment relative to what the payer faces when they're dealing with patients in their cohort, right? So real world evidence matters, but I'd also, too often I see organizations wait until they see the pivotal data to start thinking about how do we assess value here and so forth, and you've got to do it much sooner than that. You've got to be thinking about that as part of your assumption set, I would argue, by the time you start phase 2. And particularly as we move to narrower patient populations, whether these be orphan or ultra-orphan diseases or genetically defined subsets of patients, you really have to be thinking about up front, what is the real value that can be delivered and how do we assess value? In certain therapeutic areas, you can make the case that you're saving the system money and you're going to share that savings, right? That's the easiest case to make, and even then, there'll be a great degree of skepticism and folks won't want to take risk in that circumstance. But when we move beyond just dislocating costs that would net to a lower cost to the system for the management of a patient, and you start talking about what is the value of a year, a quality adjusted life year, now you've just added a whole nother layer of complexity to the conversation. And if you're, trying to put together your filing to get approval, at the same time you're trying to sort this stuff all out, you're not setting your organization up for success. You've got to start that conversation much earlier to figure out how you're going to make the case with state, federal, and commercial payers on what the value of that product is and how you're going to assess the value once the patients start taking it in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of, just to that point, what we're seeing is that a lot of times in phase 2, the thought process of what your label looks like, what the expectation is, understanding your market access environment when that product launches, is not taken into consideration, right? And so you're kind of behind the 8 ball. So if you think about what does the access environment consist of? How competitive is it? What products are in formularies if it's not an ultra-orphan, obviously, or an oncology product at this point in time. But how does that environment play into how you design your phase 3? What do you think payers are going to do, right? So we've seen them take control, right, to some degree, where the FDA approval bar is here and the access bar now is here, right? And so if you have a complex patient population where there's multiple subtypes, right? We've seen this with Spinraza, there's many other examples of that, and they've limited to a trial inclusion-exclusion criteria or specific subtypes of patients that are studied, and they have a broad label. You have to be able to communicate that to the stakeholders and which patients are going to get your product and why is it beneficial to that particular patient population. And so thinking about that label and what that access environment looks like back in phase 2 is extremely important as you design your phase 3 protocols.
And I think throughout this discussion, we've been highlighting a challenge which I see on a day-to-day basis, which is that the notion of value holds a lot of appeal for many different stakeholders, for payers. Everybody gets behind the idea of value. However, when it comes to actually beginning to define it, that's where I see a lot of the challenges. Do any of you have thoughts on how we can take the conversation regarding value-based pricing from sort of the 100,000-foot level to beginning to drill down and actually trying to find that common ground between the different stakeholders?
Yeah, I don't think that we're ever going to have a common definition of value in healthcare because every single stakeholder is coming at it from a different lens, right? And so what's valuable to a manufacturer is not always what's valuable to a payer. And obviously not always going to be valuable to the constituent who is also the patient, which all of us, could be at some point. I think everybody's lens on value is different. What I will say is that where the commonality of what value should be is in the scope of quality measurement. I think that as we move toward, quality doesn't get enough street cred or love from us and the entire community. We have many, many quality measures that have been developed by medical specialty societies, CMS, and many of those are process measures, right? Like check the box. Did you give a person a beta blocker when they came in to the hospital with, complaining of chest pain so that they don't, die in the parking lot on the way out? Or did you, do you do this, that, or that when the patient comes into the office? And those things matter. But developing meaningful quality measures, which links back to the data, right? Like back to your phase 2, 3 readout or real world evidence that demonstrates survival overall or, progression-free in the cases of oncology or in other disease states, bleeding or other variables that can be shared in definition. So I feel personally that the term quality is very nebulous and that it will vary by disease state, it will vary by stakeholder, but by disease state, if you will, or by stakeholder, the one kind of common ground is developing measurements that we can all align on to set that baseline of what a quality, success would be, and then linking that to your value-based contract or outcome.
Mike or Aaron, any additional thoughts on that question?
I think patient-reported outcomes is an important tool in this conversation. I don't think it's the only tool in this conversation. I think to the degree that we are able to identify either clinical manifestations of a disease or ideally biomarkers that predict and are highly correlated with the positive outcome you're shooting for, you facilitate the conversation around a value-based construct for your therapeutic with a payer, right? So much of what we produce has effect by the absence of a negative consequence in the future. So that's a hard thing to measure, right? You can measure it on a population basis, but we pay on a patient basis. We don't pay on a population basis. We set price often on a population basis, but we pay again on a patient basis. So you have to translate that population impact into how am I going to measure it for Mary, Harry, and Sue when they start this new therapy. And a patient-reported outcome, which is sort of a shorthand for the quality I think that Tamar's talking about, is one way to do that. Ideally, you have both that, where the caregiver or the patient is assessing the impact on their life, but you also have a biological marker that says, we know from our clinical work that this change in X is highly correlated with this positive outcome, even when you follow the patients for many years. And so the combination of those things, I think, really unlocks the possibility of having a thoughtful, value-based way to be reimbursed for the impact we're having on patients' lives.
Yeah, and I think patient-reported outcomes from a payer perspective, if you look at what their value drivers are, tend to be lower on the list than higher, right? I mean, that's part of the challenge is that the value drivers for each of these stakeholders are different. They're not the same. They're different scales, and so how do you bring that together? And part of the thing is these tools, right? So like the EQ5D or the SF36 and those types of things were developed at a time where one size kind of fits all. And so how do you bring those together and develop more therapeutic specific and precision tools that will resonate to a payer outside of just bringing advocacy in, and that way you get a patient quality of life. For cardiac types of measures, a 6-minute walk test, that resonates to a payer, but does that resonate to a patient? Probably not. Can they get in the shower and take a shower and do normal daily living functioning things? That's what's important to the patient. But to the payer, it's a 6-minute walk test. Right? There's a huge disconnect there. And I think that's part of the challenge that we need to address.
So I have one more question on my end, and then I'm going to open it up to the others here in the audience to ask questions. But I wanted to ask you all to take out your crystal ball and predict for me what important new development in value-based pricing are we going to be talking about at next year's conference?
I mean, I would say there's a couple things, right? I mean, we're 2 days post-Mueller investigation, right? The focus is on the 2020 election, and Trump stated that healthcare is his #1 priority, but the biotech stocks haven't moved, right? So is what are his plans? What's the goal of the 2020 election going to be? I think that's going to be the discussion for next year. Is this healthcare system going to pick winners and losers? What does that look like? I think that's probably going to be the focus of next year, some of these policy things. The rebates will be another one. I think if you think about the whole PBM rebate situation, for some manufacturers it can be a very positive thing. For other manufacturers it can be a negative thing. And I'll just give you a quick example of that. If you're a manufacturer and you're using rebates to get on formulary, and rebates are taken away, then that's going to have a negative side effect on the utilization and uptake of your product and access, right? You will have very limited access to the product. If you're a different manufacturer and you're using rebates to just play with the other one of three or one of two that are on that formulary, and rebates go away, well then your net price increases. Your net price is much better than what it was, right? We all hear manufacturers say, listen, our list price is $100,000, our net price is $40,000. So take away the rebates and your list price goes up. So depending on what your asset is and how competitive the space is and what the payers are doing to those products on formulary, it can be a very positive or a very negative type of situation that you're dealing with.
And that identifies my hope. I don't know how confident I am it will be the case a year from now, but I hope we're talking about transparency in the system.
Agreed.
That we can actually track the dollars and who's making what dollars in the system. Because I think if we do that, the value that our industry is delivering to patients around the world will become much more obvious than it is currently with the opacity that exists between when the stuff leaves our warehouse and when a patient actually consumes the product.
I agree, Mike, with you wholeheartedly. I think two things will be discussed, which is I think there will be greater emphasis at the federal level on the transparency. There is most, if not all of you know that, the manufacturers had their day on Capitol Hill, a few weeks ago, and glad that's all behind us in one sense of the word, but the PBMs are going to have their day on the Hill on April 9th, and I think this all links to transparency, to Mike's point, and understanding the value of the supply chain and where those dollars go. And I think as more expensive therapies come into the market and understanding how those therapies will contribute to the cost of the system, and having that transparency is going to be a key asset to how we talk about value in the future.
Okay, great. So with that, I'll turn it over to the audience if anybody has any questions. I think there are mics, so they'll come find you.
I am Maggie Pax.
We can hear you.
We can hear
All right,
you.
you can hear me. Question for you, Mike. Maggie Pax from Thermo Fisher's Clinical Trials Division. My question is, it seems so attractive to think about going to a payer and going at risk and saying that we're going to share some of the risk. But if I'm a payer, my patient churn, my coverage is continual. So if I go at risk with you on a particular
Yep.
medication and my patients disenroll next year, doesn't that put me at more risk than I can really handle?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I do think that there has been a movement within the payer community, at least over the trajectory of my career, from a view that was very well aligned with what you said, which is if you can't prove to me that I'm going to get value in the 2.3 years that I have this patient in my cohort, I'm not, you're going to have to rebate like crazy in order to get access to my cohort. I think what they're beginning to realize is that this churn that exists within the commercial markets, and as the commercial players have become administrators for Medicaid and Medicare, is they're going to get as much as they give. And so I actually have seen this particular barrier come down even as the therapies have become more effective and more expensive on a list price basis. The willingness of the payers to say, okay, I'll go at risk, because while I know I'm going to lose a certain cohort here, I'm going to also gain certain cohorts as the marketplace churns a little bit here. What's remarkable to me, quite frankly, is in single payer systems that where you would think that the benefit would accrue one of the challenges we have in the U.S. system, in my view, is the incentives to the various pieces of the value chain are just completely different, right? And so if you believe that treating hepatitis C is going to reduce liver transplant, liver cancer, and ultimately save the system money, it should be easy to pay for hepatitis C, right? But the problem is the payers who will benefit from that reduction in costs in the future have outsourced the risk of the pharmaceutical benefit to the PBM. And the PBM has no skin in the game around the savings by reduced liver transplants and reduced liver cancers. So you have a fundamental disconnect in incentives in the system. So you'd think in a single payer system where it all accrues to the cost of caring for your population as a government, that there would be a better appreciation that I can invest today in medicines that will reduce the expensive outcomes at the back end, and yet we haven't seen that transpire. And I attribute that, rightly or wrongly, to the difference between a human life, which is measured in decades, hopefully, and the political process, which is usually measured in somewhere between 2 and 5 years. And we've got to figure out a way to get our policymakers to think beyond the next election, no matter where you are in the world, in my view, if we're really going to be rational about how we allocate resources to improving the health of our populations.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great. My name is Alex Schumann. I head up corporate social responsibility at Alexion Pharmaceuticals. And my question has to do with this kind of disconnect between some of these broken systems we're talking about and expectations from external stakeholders when it comes to the hot topic of ESG, environment, social governance aspects. And how do you reconcile the fact that a number of these systems are broken when there is an expectation for you to take a solid stance and say something that is concrete and over the long term with some of these ratings and rankings agencies?
Good question. Mike, you want to take it? You want me to-
Yeah.
you want-
I joked with my colleagues here on the pre-call that no sitting CEO would ever agree to talk about this subject, so that's why I got that. So, look, Tamar said something earlier that I think is my response is very similar to what Tamar said and what this question is, which is, for a whole host of reasons, our society has decided that we can make fundamental decisions about a wide range of things based on sound bites. And what I've tried to do over the course of my career is resist the temptation to simplify that which is inherently complex. Now, I don't think you can overwhelm an audience with complexity. I think it's easy to do that, and I think you have to be careful you don't do that. But with respect to ESG, to my way of thinking, it is, you still have to underpromise and overdeliver, and the most important thing is not that you have reached the Holy Land now and basically for every dollar of revenue your company generates, society benefits to the tune of $200. What you want to do, I think, is to show progress, that the way you're operating your business increasingly scores positively on these measures. Now, some will argue that this is not a function of how it operates in the real world, but frankly, if the real world is forcing us to simplify things which are inherently complex, they're not operating in the right mindset either. So my view boiled down is do what you think is right, track what you do to show and learn that you're getting better and better at doing it, whatever it is, in this case ESG, and resist the temptation to oversimplify, and certainly don't overpromise. Senator Kennedy said to me one time when I was talking to him about drugs, and this was in the biosimilars legislation days, he said, Mike, you know, the thing you have to remember is we on the Hill are an inch deep and a mile wide. If you talk science to us, our eyes will glaze over and we won't have any earthly idea. But what I know is that my constituents call me and say, how come it costs me $300 or $3,000 or whatever it is out of pocket to save my child's life? That's what I'm going to react to, because I can understand what they're saying. So there is a need for us to simplify, but we can't go so far as to create an expectation that this is going to be readily solved, whether this is value-based pricing or whether it's making progress from an ESG calculator standpoint.
Any other questions?
Yeah, my name is Louis Scotti. I'm with Irisys in San Diego, and I've been in the industry for decades, and so frustrating that the messaging that we've tried in the pharmaceutical industry has really failed miserably. Because today, you know, we are pigeonholed and politically soundbited into the greedy pharmaceutical industry. And a lot of what you just said, Mike, is kind of what I was thinking about. But how do we message? How do we message that elevator pitch? What is that elevator pitch that someone's going to listen to in 30 seconds and is going to be able to counteract the greedy pharmaceutical industry high pricing that is coming out of both sides of the political parties? And you know, every time I hear that, I just cringe.
Yeah,
And we just haven't been able to successfully answer that in a 30-second soundbite.
So this is a problem that's spanned for those of us who, when dating myself, have been in this industry for 20 years or more. You may be able to remember back when pharma had a problem, we picked up Montel Williams and went on a bus across America. So we tried to fix it. Some of us remember that? No? Raise your hands. So on the Oprah show, on Montel's show, whatever. So I mean, I think we've tried to, you know, soundbite it and kind of you know, condense the messaging in a way that we could, you know, be pharma across America and be friendly to everybody. And then, you know, the challenge that we have is that politics is like fashion. So bell bottoms are out now, but they'll be back again when our kids are, you know, the age we were when we thought they were cool. And so I think politics works very much the same way, in the sense that, you know, all things circle back and come back around, and here we are again. So the issue is that, for me anyway, that I think that our country has evolved to Twitter or, you know, social media sound bites, and so to try to find that elevator pitch is very difficult. And I think, you know, we're in a state where we have to accept that the pharmaceutical industry is more than just the manufacturer. So my answer to that generally, and what my team says when we go into state, you know, government affairs team goes in to meet with a legislator, is that the pharmaceutical industry is a number of people, right? The PBMs play a role in that, the wholesalers, and understanding the supply chain. And this message is resonating. And at the beginning, I mentioned that all policies, whether good or bad, in my opinion, you know, bubble up and start at the state level. We are incubators for whatever happens federally. And you're seeing that now in many states, the conversation around the PBM. If you look at states like Ohio, who investigated their PBMs and found out that their PBMs were charging them more than what was being charged on the commercial side to the state, and wanted to release that report publicly, and then got sued by their PBM. You know, I think that you have to just broaden the conversation to say, okay, if you want to talk about, you know, the pharmaceutical industry, then what is your definition of that? Is it the manufacturer? Because there are 4 other players here that we could talk about who play a role in this, you know, supply chain. That's not an easy elevator pitch, but I think the answer, in short, is you do, back to what Mike said, you just have to have a story that resonates with people. When you tell somebody that it's not a manufacturer that sets the price that you pay, and the 4 people on this, you know, panel are going to go into their pharmacies, get the same drug, and pay 4 different costs, that's easy to understand. You know, it's like, well, that's not right. Why is that the case? And then have the conversation, you know, around why, because each health plan or PBM gets to choose that cost at the patient level. People easily understand that. So I think it's back to the patient, back to the story that makes sense, that's sensical to the layperson. And that's not always an elevator soundbite, but it has to be the lay conversation that hits home with most people.
I think we often in the industry lose sight of the fact that we're a patient. We talk about it internally a lot, that we're patient-driven, but we don't behave like it, and we certainly don't speak like it when we speak publicly. If we could stop talking about the high risk and the enormous consumption of capital that is required to get a new therapy to market, and start talking about the fact that we are changing the lives or saving the lives of millions of patients around the world. And yes, it's expensive work to do, but if you think about it in the arc of human history, you pay a high price for 10 or 12 years, and then it becomes almost free for humanity. This is an incredible deal. But my God, we get it all confused with, well, the probability, 10,000 compounds for every one that makes it to the market, only 1 out of 10 that makes it to the market pays it back. What does that mean to me? I'm paying too much for my diabetes meds. If I don't have my diabetes meds, I die. I don't know what the hell you're talking about. Well, you wouldn't have had your diabetes meds if we hadn't been able to charge a fair price 15 years ago so that med could be discovered and made to market. And I think we just as an industry, we have to get it. I know we spend a lot of time, we raise tons of billions of in capital every year, and so we have to talk the investor language, but we talk it all the time, and I think we need to vary our language where the audience varies. Okay. And I think the U.S. consumer is sophisticated enough that they can get it.
Okay,
Hi.
unfortunately.
This is the last question?
Okay,
Okay.
sure. We'll have one more. We're out of time and it's blinking, but
Thank you.
we'll.
Okay, I'm Jen Beachel. I'm a commercialization expert. Thank you for this incredible panel. I just wonder if you could add on to what you were saying around transparency.
Sure.
And I think what Mike is saying around, patients really deserve the true understanding of pricing and value and the definition of value. Particularly, is there a role for bio, pharma, PCMA, and AMCP to come together and create some way to be transparent around pricing and value? Maybe you guys could talk about that.
I'm just going to start quickly and then I'll pass it down. I think it was Dr. Levin who had the slide up at the beginning. That was bio slide. It was a slide that showed the supply chain and a diabetic patient paying $408 for a drug that was list priced at $400. I think that's the sweet spot for transparency. So making sure patients understand. One of the things that I mentioned earlier in the conversation is the gag clauses, that if you have insurance, sometimes it's hard to know that you could pay less if you don't have insurance or you pay cash than what you're paying under the insurance model. And so somehow working together to get to Mike's point, to the patient and what is coming out of their pocket, understanding what the cost of that product is and, at manufacturing that list price, which is fictitious, so maybe it's net, I don't know, but whatever that price is that started the supply chain and how it got to that patient is important for us to get to that place. And I hate to ever compare our industry to automobiles or cell phones because we're not that. But the reality is that most people think that I do think that this is my life, right? And I'm happy to pay $1,000 for it. But Apple makes $500 on every single one of these. That is huge revenue, but nobody's complaining that they're gouging the system or that they're evil doers. Most people see them as, great partners in society. And so I think it's, how do we get to a place where we have clear understandings of what our products are, the value to the system, and how to get people to be able to afford them fairly. I know I'm not necessarily answering your question directly, sorry, but there is a role for bio and pharma to play in that. And so the resources and tools that they have put out into the system, albeit complex, is a starting point. There are conversations that I can't have as a manufacturer with my colleagues like you because of anti-kickback, antitrust. And so for me, the trade associations play a huge role in helping us to have a shared voice, both at the state and federal level. We turn to Bob and his experience on the Hill every day. That plays a huge role in helping us to have those conversations with the governor's office right now about a number of bills that we don't think are fair, and also working with the advocacy organizations. I will just re-emphasize what Mike has said, that we have to start talking about what things mean to the patient and starting there first, because if we don't include advocacy organizations or patients themselves in the conversation, sometimes that gets lost. So my feedback would be, in my traditional pharma hat here, can we have an ad board of patients to ask them what that transparency would look like and start there versus us, kind of from the ivory tower saying this is what good should look like?
I think one thing the trade associations can do on this topic is to become stronger and more assertive policemen, if you will. And what I mean by that is we got bad actors in our industry. Let's not kid ourselves. We see the headlines regularly. Fortunately, not so much in the last 12 months or so, but prior to that. I think that the trade associations should be in front of this news, not behind this news, and saying to those entities, you're not part of our ecosystem, and so you're not going to be part of our organization, and we're not going to take your funds, and we're not going to represent your interests, either the state or the federal level, and distance ourselves from the bad actors in the space, because there are bad actors, as there are in every space.
I think going back to the value question, I think if we need to, and the transparency is to not be just transparent on drug pricing and these types of things, but on the entire healthcare system, right? Are you really getting the
Right.
best value for your dollar going to Harvard, or are you going to a community hospital? Like that is the bigger conversation here, is to broaden it into healthcare in general, right? And the dialogue is there. I think that unfortunately the pharmaceutical industry has been siloed into a hole where now even the EMR systems, where providers, when they prescribe products, the EMR systems, just like TripAdvisor does with the number of dollar signs, they know which products are more expensive than others. And that's starting to be a movement across the industry as well, right? And they even have pharmacists to come on and say, listen, you selected this
details.
product, this needs to be this product. And so, but that's all around drug pricing, right? And it's not around what's really going on in the healthcare system in general. And transparency on that, I think, is where the conversation needs to shift to.
Well, I hate to cut off a great conversation, and I hope we can extend the dialogue, so thank you all.